Voodoo and Christianity. Two spiritual worlds that are often seen as enemies, locked in an eternal battle of light against darkness. For centuries, voodoo has been portrayed as the dark, mysterious other, a practice whispered about in fearful tones, painted in Hollywood as a religion of curses, dolls, and sinister magic. In contrast, Christianity is often presented as the force of light, a faith of redemption and divine love. This is the image that has been burned into the minds of millions, a story told by missionaries, colonial authorities, and sensationalized media. But the truth is far more complex. Voodoo, or Vodou, is not the sinister force that popular culture makes it out to be. It is a deeply spiritual tradition rooted in the sacred beliefs of West Africa, carried across the Atlantic by enslaved Africans who refused to abandon their gods, their ancestors, and their sacred rituals. In the brutal world of slavery, where their cultures were systematically erased, voodoo became a sanctuary, a way of preserving their identity, healing their suffering, and resisting their oppressors. It was a faith of resilience, a sacred connection to the divine that could not be destroyed. But voodoo did not exist in isolation. As enslaved Africans were baptized into Christianity by force, a strange and powerful fusion began to take shape. In Haiti, voodoo practitioners saw the faces of their African spirits in the images of Catholic saints. Saint-Damballah, the great serpent spirit, became Saint Patrick. Erzulie, the goddess of love, took on the form of the Virgin Mary. Crosses, holy water, and sacred chants, all symbols of Christianity, were woven into the rituals of voodoo, creating a new spiritual tapestry where Catholicism and African spirituality coexisted, not as enemies, but as two sides of the same sacred coin. This story of voodoo and Christianity is not just a story of conflict, it is also a story of coexistence, a tale of how two spiritual worlds met, clashed, and transformed each other. It is a story of resistance, where voodoo became a weapon of spiritual survival against the brutality of slavery. It is a story of sacred blending, where the symbols of Christianity became vessels for ancient African spirits. And it is a story of spiritual freedom, where even today, there are those who honor both voodoo and Christianity without contradiction. This video explores the true relationship between voodoo and Christianity, peeling back the myths, revealing the hidden stories, and uncovering the truth about two faiths that have been both rivals and allies. We will explore how voodoo was demonized by colonial powers, how it survived persecution, how it transformed Christianity, and how it continues to thrive today, both as a distinct faith and as a spiritual force that cannot be contained. Voodoo and Christianity are not simply enemies. They are two sacred paths that have shaped each other in profound and unexpected ways. To understand the true nature of voodoo, we must begin not with the sensationalized images of Hollywood, but with the sacred lands of West Africa, where this spiritual tradition was born. Long before voodoo became known in the Americas, it was a sacred faith practiced by the Yoruba, Fon, Ewe, and other West African peoples. Here, the divine was not a distant force, but a living presence that touched every aspect of life. The world was alive with spiritual power, inhabited by gods, ancestors, and sacred forces who guided, protected, and judged humanity. This sacred world was carried across the Atlantic by enslaved Africans who were torn from their homelands but refused to abandon their gods. The journey from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of suffering and loss. Millions of Africans were chained in the dark holds of slave ships, treated as property, stripped of their names, their families, and their freedom. But even in this brutal journey, they carried with them the sacred songs, chants, stories, and rituals of their ancestors. These sacred memories became seeds, planted in the harsh soil of slavery, where they grew into a new spiritual tradition, Haitian Vodou, the most well-known form of voodoo. At the heart of voodoo is a sacred hierarchy of spiritual beings, beginning with Bondi, the supreme god, who is the creator of all things but remains distant, beyond direct human reach. To communicate with Bondi, believers turn to the Loa, a pantheon of powerful spirits who govern different aspects of life. These Loa are not just abstract forces, they are living beings with distinct personalities, preferences, and sacred symbols. There is Damballah, the great serpent spirit, a symbol of wisdom, healing, and the cycle of life. There is Erzulie, the goddess of love, beauty, and feminine power, whose sacred color is pink, and who is honored with sweet offerings and perfumes. Ogu is the fierce spirit of iron, war, and courage, who is invoked for strength and protection. And there's Papa Legba, the wise old man who stands at the crossroads, the sacred gatekeeper, who must be honored before any other spirit can be approached. Voodoo is not a religion of blind fear or dark magic. It is a faith of sacred connection where the spirits are not demons but divine guides, protectors, and healers. Rituals are a central part of voodoo practice where believers gather in sacred circles, sing ancient songs, dance in rhythmic trance, and offer food, rum, candles, and sacred herbs to the Loa. Priests and priestesses, known as Houngans and Mambos, lead these ceremonies, serving as spiritual intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. These rituals are not just performances, they are sacred acts where the spirits are invited to possess their followers, offering healing, prophecy, and protection. Yet, despite its sacred nature, voodoo is one of the most misunderstood spiritual traditions in the world. For centuries, it has been demonized and distorted, transformed into a dark and sinister force in the Western imagination. The image of the voodoo doll, pierced with pins to bring suffering, is a complete fabrication, a Hollywood invention with no basis in traditional voodoo practice. In reality, dolls in voodoo are sacred objects used to honor the spirits, protect the home, or channel healing energy. The idea of voodoo as a faith of curses, black magic, and devil worship is a colonial myth, a story told by missionaries and colonial authorities to demonize the faith of the enslaved. It is a false image that continues to haunt popular culture, obscuring the true beauty, wisdom, and spirituality of voodoo. But even within the Americas, voodoo is not a single, monolithic faith. It is a diverse and evolving tradition, taking on different forms in different places. Haitian Vodou, which emerged in the brutal world of French colonial Haiti, is the most famous form, with its sacred rites, its powerful Loa, and its syncretism with Catholicism. Here, African spirits are honored alongside Christian saints. Sacred vives, sacred symbols, are drawn on the ground, and the drums beat to the rhythm of divine possession. In New Orleans, voodoo evolved in a different way, shaped by the unique blend of African, French, Spanish, and Native American influences. Here, voodoo became a faith of resilience and adaptation, practiced in secret by enslaved Africans and free people of color. It was a faith of healing, where sacred herbs, oils, and talismans were used to protect against illness and misfortune. It was a faith of resistance, where enslaved people gathered in Congo Square to drum, dance, and honor the spirits. And it was a faith of sacred power, where figures like Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen of New Orleans, became symbols of spiritual strength and wisdom. Voodoo is not a dark and dangerous cult. It is a faith of resilience, a sacred connection to the divine, and a reminder of the spiritual strength that sustained millions of enslaved Africans in the face of unimaginable suffering. It is a faith of healing, of protection, of sacred transformation. It is a faith where the divine is not distant but present, where the spirits are not demons but ancestors, and where the sacred is found not in fear, but in faith. The arrival of Christianity in the lands where voodoo would later take root was not a gentle introduction, it was an invasion. European colonization swept across Africa and the Americas like a storm, bringing with it a new faith that claimed to be the one true religion. Missionaries, backed by the power of colonial empires, saw it as their sacred duty to convert the heathen souls of Africa and the enslaved people of the New World. In their eyes, the gods of Africa were demons, the ancestral spirits were false idols, and the sacred rituals were nothing more than sorcery. To save these souls, they believed, the old faiths had to be destroyed. Colonial authorities imposed Christianity with force, using the Bible as both a tool of spiritual conversion and a weapon of cultural domination. Enslaved Africans were baptized against their will, given Christian names, and forced to attend church services where they were taught that their ancestral beliefs were evil. In French colonies like Haiti, Catholicism was the state religion, and priests preached that the African spirits were demons, that the sacred drums were the voice of the devil, and that those who refused to convert would suffer in hell. Enslaved people who were caught practicing their traditional faiths were punished severely, beaten, whipped, imprisoned, or even executed. Their sacred objects were burned, their shrines destroyed, and their spiritual leaders silenced. But the spirit of African spirituality was not so easily erased. Beneath the forced veneer of Christianity, the sacred faith of the ancestors survived, hidden but alive. In the darkness of the sugar plantations, in the secret gatherings of the enslaved, voodoo became a sacred weapon of spiritual resistance. Enslaved Africans gathered at night to sing sacred songs, dance to the sacred rhythms of the drums, and honor the Loa, the divine spirits who had not abandoned them. These rituals were not just acts of faith, they were acts of defiance, a way of remembering who they were, a way of healing the wounds of enslavement, and a way of maintaining the sacred bond with the divine. But even as they resisted, enslaved Africans found themselves in a strange world where Christianity was everywhere, its symbols, its prayers, its saints. Rather than rejecting these symbols, they transformed them. This was the birth of syncretism, a sacred blending where Christian saints became the faces of the African Loa. The image of Saint Patrick, with his snakes, became a symbol of Damballah, the great serpent spirit of wisdom and creation. The image of the Virgin Mary, her face gentle and compassionate, became the sacred image of Erzulie, the goddess of love, beauty, and divine compassion. Saint James the Greater, the warrior saint, became Ogo, the fierce spirit of iron, war, and courage. In this sacred blending, the enslaved did not abandon their gods, they disguised them. Even the sacred rituals of Catholicism became vessels for the African spirit. Holy water became a sacred tool for cleansing, candles became sacred lights for the Loa, and the crucifix became a powerful symbol of spiritual protection. In Haiti, where Catholicism was the official religion, voodoo ceremonies often began with the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, a way of honoring both the Christian faith that had been imposed on them and the African faith that they refused to abandon. Churches became sacred spaces not just for the Christian God, but for the African spirits who were honored in secret. This syncretism was not an act of betrayal, it was an act of survival. A sacred adaptation where the African gods wore Christian faces, where the cross became a sacred symbol, and where the songs of the enslaved were both Christian hymns and ancient African chants. It was a faith of sacred resistance, where the enslaved could stand before the priests, cross themselves, recite the Lord's Prayer, and yet know in their hearts that they were speaking not only to the Christian God, but to the Loa who had followed them across the sea. In this sacred blending, Christianity itself was transformed. The saints became more than distant figures in stained glass windows. They became living spirits, divine beings who could heal, protect, and offer guidance. The crucifix was not only a symbol of sacrifice, it was a sacred charm, a crossroad between the human and the divine. And even today, in the sacred rites of voodoo, the saints and the Loa are honored side by side, a living testament to the resilience of African spirituality, which refused to die even in the face of colonial oppression. The sacred blending of voodoo and Christianity is one of the most remarkable stories of spiritual resilience and adaptation in history. It is a story of how two seemingly opposing faiths, one born in the sacred lands of West Africa, the other rooted in the holy scriptures of the Middle East, did not simply clash but merged in a sacred dance of transformation. This process, known as syncretism, was not just a survival strategy for enslaved Africans. It was a sacred art, a way of honoring the old gods while adapting to a new spiritual world. It was a testament to the creativity, resilience, and sacred wisdom of a people who refused to abandon their divine inheritance. Syncretism began with the most profound truth of African spirituality, that the divine is vast, that the gods have many faces, and that sacred power can manifest in countless forms. Faced with the brutal suppression of their ancestral faith, enslaved Africans did not abandon their gods, they simply gave them new faces. Catholic saints, whose images filled the churches and homes of the European colonizers, became sacred masks for the African Loa, the powerful spirits who had guided their ancestors. The image of Saint Patrick, who was often depicted driving snakes from Ireland, became a sacred symbol of Damballah, the great serpent spirit of wisdom, creation, and healing. Erzulie, the goddess of love, sweetness, and feminine power, took on the face of the Virgin Mary, her gentle gaze and sacred heart, a reflection of divine compassion. This sacred blending was not an act of deception, it was an act of sacred wisdom. Enslaved Africans saw the divine in the faces of the saints, recognizing in them the same sacred qualities they had known in their own gods. The saints were not enemies, they were vessels, sacred reflections of the divine power that flowed through all things. Even the symbols of Catholicism became sacred tools for voodoo practice. Crosses became powerful charms, sacred symbols of protection and spiritual power. Holy water, used by Catholic priests to bless and cleanse, became a sacred tool in voodoo rituals, used to purify the body and summon the spirits. Candles, which burned in church altars, became sacred lights that called forth the Loa, their flames a beacon for divine blessings. Nowhere was this sacred blending more profound than in Haitian Vodou, where African spirits and Catholic saints were not just connected, they were inseparable. The sacred rites of Vodou often began with Catholic prayers, the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary, spoken in reverence not only to the Christian God, but to the Loa, who listened in silence. The sacred vives, intricate symbols drawn on the ground in cornmeal, became sacred maps, each one representing the presence of a Loa. These vives were not just African, they were often marked with Christian crosses, a reminder that the two faiths had become one. Voodoo altars were decorated with images of the saints, but these images were not simply Christian, they were also the sacred faces of the Loa. Saint James, the warrior saint, was also Ogu, the fierce spirit of iron and war. Saint Anthony became Legba, the wise old man who stood at the crossroads. In New Orleans, a city where African, French, Spanish, and Native American cultures met and mingled, voodoo took on a unique form. Here, the influence of French Catholicism was powerful, but so was the sacred wisdom of Africa. Voodoo altars in New Orleans were adorned with statues of saints, but beneath these holy images, the Loa listened. The famous voodoo queen Marie Laveau was a devout Catholic who attended Mass regularly and used holy water, crosses, and rosary beads in her voodoo practice. For her, there was no contradiction. The saints were her allies, and the power of the Church was a sacred tool that could be used to heal, protect, and bless. This sacred blending was not just a survival strategy, it was a sacred truth, a recognition that the divine was greater than any single faith. For those who practiced voodoo, the saints were not a betrayal of their African gods, they were another face of the same sacred power. Voodoo was not simply African or Christian, it was both. It was a faith of sacred unity, where the sacred waters of African spirituality flowed beneath the holy altars of Catholicism, where the drums of the Loa beat beneath the hymns of the saints, where the power of the cross was not a symbol of oppression, but a sacred charm that protected the faithful. This sacred blending did not destroy voodoo, it transformed it. It made voodoo a faith of profound spiritual depth, a religion of healing, protection, and sacred wisdom. It made voodoo a faith that could speak to the Christian God without abandoning the Loa, that could light candles for the saints while dancing for the spirits. It made voodoo a sacred mirror, where the divine could be seen in many faces, heard in many voices, and felt in the sacred rhythms of the drums. It was a relationship born in the fires of conflict and condemnation. For centuries, voodoo has been demonized, distorted, and misunderstood, portrayed not as a sacred faith, but as a dark and dangerous cult. This demonization did not begin with Hollywood. It began with the missionaries and colonial authorities who saw African spirituality as a threat to their religious and political control. To them, the gods of Africa were demons, the sacred drums were the voice of evil, and the rituals of voodoo were nothing more than black magic. The colonial campaign against voodoo was relentless. Missionaries preached that voodoo was the work of the devil, that the Loa were fallen angels, and that those who practiced voodoo were condemned to hell. In the Caribbean, where voodoo flourished among enslaved Africans, Catholic priests condemned the sacred dances as devilish, the sacred songs as blasphemy, and the sacred symbols as witchcraft. In Haiti, French colonial authorities passed laws against voodoo practice, punishing those caught performing sacred rituals with imprisonment, whipping, or even death. The sacred drums, which were the heartbeat of voodoo, were smashed and sacred objects were burned. Voodoo priests and priestesses were hunted down, accused of sorcery, and persecuted. This colonial propaganda was not just a campaign of religious conversion, it was a tool of social control. By demonizing voodoo, the colonizers sought to strip enslaved Africans of their cultural identity, to sever them from the sacred traditions that gave them strength and unity. They knew that voodoo was more than just a religion. It was a source of spiritual resilience, a faith that empowered the enslaved to resist despair, to heal their suffering, and to maintain their sense of identity. By labeling voodoo as devil worship, they sought to turn Africans against their own gods, to make them ashamed of their sacred heritage. But the campaign of condemnation did not end with the missionaries. It was transformed and amplified in the 20th century by the power of Hollywood and the mass media. The image of voodoo as a dark, sinister force spread across the world in the form of horror films, pulp novels, and sensational news stories. Voodoo became a favorite subject of Hollywood's horror industry, where it was depicted as a religion of curses, zombies, and evil magic. In these films, voodoo priests were portrayed as sinister sorcerers, voodoo dolls were shown as tools of supernatural torment, and the sacred rituals were transformed into terrifying scenes of black magic. These distorted images of voodoo were so powerful that they overshadowed the truth, turning a sacred faith into a symbol of fear. But even as voodoo was demonized, it survived. In the shadows of the colonial world, in the hidden groves and secret altars, the faithful continued to honor the Loa, to sing the sacred songs, and to dance the sacred dances. Voodoo did not simply disappear, it went underground. In Haiti, voodoo priests and priestesses continued to serve their communities in secret, offering healing, protection, and spiritual guidance. In New Orleans, voodoo practitioners gathered in the shadows of Congo Square, where they drummed, danced, and called upon the spirits under the watchful eyes of the authorities. Voodoo survived because it was more than a set of rituals. It was a sacred truth, a living connection to the divine, a faith that lived in the hearts of the people. Even in the face of persecution, voodoo priests and priestesses stood as sacred guardians, protecting the spiritual wisdom of their ancestors. They were healers, using sacred herbs, oils, and charms to cure the sick. They were spiritual warriors, using the power of the Loa to protect their communities from harm. They were counselors, offering wisdom and comfort to those in despair. They were sacred teachers, who passed down the sacred songs, the sacred dances, and the sacred stories from one generation to the next. Voodoo did not just survive, it thrived. In Haiti, it became a powerful force of resistance, fueling the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved Africans rose up against their French oppressors, guided by the sacred fire of voodoo. In New Orleans, it became a faith of healing and empowerment, where figures like Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen, became symbols of spiritual strength. Even as the colonial world tried to destroy it, voodoo remained a faith of sacred resilience, a faith that refused to die. Despite centuries of conflict, demonization, and condemnation, the relationship between voodoo and Christianity has not always been one of opposition. In fact, for many believers, these two faiths are not enemies. They are two sacred paths that coexist, two rivers that flow together in a single spiritual journey. In Haiti, in New Orleans, and across the African diaspora, there are countless men and women who are both voodooists and Christians, who see no contradiction between praying to the Christian God on Sunday and honoring the Loa in sacred ceremonies on Saturday night. These are the dual believers, those who walk between two worlds with faith in both. For these believers, Christianity and voodoo are not rivals but complements. They pray to Jesus Christ, but they also call upon Papa Legba, the sacred gatekeeper who opens the way to the spirit world. They revere the Virgin Mary, but they also offer sweet cakes and perfumes to Erzulie, the goddess of love. They light candles in church, but they also light sacred candles for the Loa, asking for their blessings and protection. In their eyes, the saints are not strangers. They are sacred reflections of the same divine power that flows through the Loa. To them, Saint Michael, the warrior saint, is also Ogu, the spirit of iron and war. Saint Peter, who holds the keys to heaven, is also Papa Legba, who stands at the crossroads. This is not confusion, it is sacred unity. One believer, Marie, speaks of how she has been both Catholic and Voodooist her entire life. When I pray to the Virgin Mary, she says, I am also praying to Erzulie. When I kneel before the cross, I know that Christ is with me, but I also feel the presence of Damballah, the great serpent spirit who brings wisdom and healing. They are not enemies, they are my sacred family. Another believer, Jean-Pierre, tells of how his grandmother taught him to respect both the Bible and the sacred vives of voodoo. She told me that the saints are our friends, but so are the Loa. They both protect us. They both hear our prayers. For these dual believers, there is no need to choose between Christianity and voodoo, because they see both as sacred paths to the same divine truth. Their faith is not divided. It is whole. A sacred dance where the saints and the spirit stand side by side, where the cross and the sacred drum are both symbols of divine power. This coexistence is not just a compromise, it is a sacred truth, a recognition that the divine is vast, that the sacred has many faces, and that faith is not a prison, but a path of freedom. Even today, in the sacred temples of Haitian Vodou, the Christian cross stands proudly above the altar, while the Loa dance in sacred possession below. In New Orleans, voodoo altars are decorated with images of the saints, while the spirits are invoked with sacred prayers. In the homes of believers, the Bible and the sacred vave share the same space, two sacred symbols of divine grace. The history of voodoo and Christianity is not just a story of the past. It is a living story that still matters today, shaping identities, beliefs, and spiritual paths across the world. For the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas, this history is a sacred thread that connects them to their ancestors, a reminder that their spiritual heritage is rich, powerful, and resilient. It is a story of how their forebears refused to abandon their gods, even in the face of brutality and oppression, how they transformed the symbols of their oppressors into sacred vessels, and how they wove together two faiths to create a spirituality that was both African and Christian. For the African diaspora, this is not just history, it is identity. But this history also matters because it is a story of truth overcoming stereotypes. For too long, voodoo has been misunderstood, demonized, and reduced to a caricature of darkness and evil. Even today, many people still believe that voodoo is a religion of curses, zombies, and black magic, an image created by colonial propaganda and Hollywood horror films. Understanding the true history of voodoo is a way of breaking these stereotypes, of recognizing that it is a faith of healing, protection, and sacred wisdom. It is a way of seeing that voodoo is not a force of darkness, it is a sacred light. This history also matters because it is a story of spiritual freedom. It is a reminder that faith is not a prison. It is a path, a sacred journey where one can honor both the Loa and the saints, where one can kneel before the cross and dance to the sacred drums. It is a story of how those who were meant to be converted transformed Christianity instead, creating a sacred blend where two faiths could coexist. It is a reminder that true spirituality is not about choosing sides. It is about embracing the sacred truth that speaks to your soul. Voodoo and Christianity are not simply enemies. They are two spiritual paths that have shaped each other in profound and unexpected ways. What began as a story of conflict and condemnation became a story of sacred blending, where African spirits walked beside Christian saints, where sacred songs carried the names of both Christ and the Loa, and where the cross stood proudly above the altars of Haitian Vodou. This is not just a story of two religions. It is a story of resilience, transformation, and sacred wisdom. It is a reminder that faith is not always a battle. It can also be a bridge. As you have walked with me through this sacred journey, I speak a blessing over you. May you find clarity in your spiritual path. May you be free from fear and ignorance, and may the light of divine truth shine upon you. Whether you honor the saints, the Loa, or both, may your faith be a source of strength, healing, and peace. May you walk in the light of understanding, guided by wisdom, protected by grace, and filled with a spirit of compassion. If this journey has opened your heart or sparked your curiosity, I invite you to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to continue exploring the sacred truths that connect us all. Join the conversation, because faith is a journey, and you are not walking it alone.